echoes of silence. Women who carried wars within. When silence became a weapon. War is remembered through its noise, the thunder of artillery, the roar of planes, the collapse of buildings, the screams that tore through nights. But for women, survival often meant something quieter. It meant silence, heavy, suffocating, strategic. Silence became a shield, a prison, and a weapon all at once. The echoes of that silence never left them, reverberating through their lives long after the bombs stopped falling. Mothers taught children the art of quiet as if it were their first language. Before they could form words, they learned how to suppress them. A hand over a mouth, a look that meant don't breathe too loud, a lullaby hummed not for comfort, but to cover footsteps outside. Childhood became training in silence. That silence saved lives. But it also carved scars into hearts too young to understand why laughter itself had become dangerous. I remember hearing stories from my grandmother about the cellar where she hid with her sisters. She said the air was thick with fear, but the silence was even thicker. We did not cough, we did not move, we did not exist, she whispered decades later. Even then, her voice dropped lower, as if the walls might still be listening. The war had ended long ago, yet the silence had followed her into old age. That was her scar, silence so deeply learned that even peace could not unteach it. The truth no one tells is that silence was not emptiness, it was full. Full of unsaid words, swallowed screams, unfinished songs, women carried conversations in their minds that never reached their lips. They replayed memories they could not speak aloud. They buried confessions inside themselves, turning their own throats into graves. Silence did not erase. It preserved, embalming every terror in secrecy. The scar was not forgetting, but remembering too much, alone. Children of these women grew up under the shadow of silence. They watched their mothers avoid certain dates, their grandmothers close their eyes at certain songs, their aunts change the subject when certain names were spoken. They inherited silence like others inherit heirlooms. It was passed down not in stories, but in the refusal to tell them. That refusal itself became language, a silent grammar that shaped entire families. I once met a woman who said she never knew her mother's wartime story. Every time I asked, she looked away. Her silence was the answer. That silence became her inheritance, a gap where history should have been, a scar in the form of absence. But silence was not only prison. It was also strategy. Women whispered warnings in lullabies, hid instructions in glances, encoded truth in gestures. They learned to survive through quiet communication, weaving invisible networks stronger than spoken agreements. The scar was the constant fear of sound, the way even joy had to be measured, the way freedom of voice felt like danger. The echoes of that silence lived long after the war. Women who survived often spoke softly for the rest of their lives. They flinched at laughter, mistrusted loud voices, hushed children at celebrations. Their voices had been trained into shadows, and shadows were where they remained. This is where their story begins, not with battles, but with silence. A silence so heavy it outlasted war, so powerful it shaped generations, so deep it became both curse and memory. These are the echoes of silence, scars carried within, invisible to history, but eternal to those who lived them. The body as an archive. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their bodies became archives. Not the clean archives of libraries or museums, where history is neatly cataloged and displayed, but living, breathing records carved into flesh, bone, and muscle. Each scar, each tremor, each ache carried a memory. Even when their voices were silenced, their bodies spoke. And long after battles ended, those bodies kept telling stories no one wanted to hear. Bruises faded, but their memory lingered under the skin, surfacing in the way women moved, in the way they protected themselves from touch, in the way they stiffened at shadows. Burns from fires left patches of skin that weather could not forget, too sensitive to sun, too vulnerable to cold. Cuts from shattered glass reopened in dreams, bleeding not blood but memory. Women did not need to keep journals. Their bodies were journals, involuntary, undeniable, permanent. I remember hearing about a woman who carried a scar along her back from running through barbed wire. She had been holding her child, shielding him with her body. The scar ran deep and jagged, and she wore it like a second spine. For the rest of her life, she could not lean back comfortably in a chair. Her scar was both her survival and her sentence. She said once, "Every time it hurts, I remember I saved him." Her body had archived not only pain, but meaning. The truth no one tells is that war marked women in ways invisible to the eye. Malnutrition carved into their bones, leaving them fragile long after hunger had ended. Exhaustion etched itself into their joints, slowing steps decades later. Stress embedded itself into their nervous systems, so that sudden noises decades later triggered the same fear as bombs. Their bodies became museums of war, displaying exhibits that no one asked to see, carrying relics of knights that would not die. I met a daughter once who said her mother's hands always shook. Not violently, but enough that holding a teacup required both palms. She said it was nothing, the daughter whispered. But the tremor was an echo of years when fear demanded stillness, when adrenaline was constant, when nerves were wires pulled too tight. Her mother's body had archived anxiety as muscle memory, repeating it forever. The body also remembered in silence. Women who endured violence often carried shame in posture. Their shoulders hunched, their gaze lowered, as if to hide what had been done to them. Their silence lived not only in words withheld, but in muscles contracted, in backs curved, in breaths held. The scar was not always visible, but the body spoke a language of survival that the world refused to translate. And yet, the body also archived resilience. Calloused hands told stories of rebuilding ruins stone by stone. Wrinkled foreheads spoke of vigilance, of watching over children night after night. Worn knees remembered hours bent in prayer, even when faith felt distant. Stretch marks carried evidence of life birthed in the middle of destruction. These too were scars, but scars of defiance, proof that even when the body was broken, it remained an unyielding record of continuity. My grandmother used to say, "The body does not lie." She believed that even when memory faltered, the body held truth. Her arthritis, she said, was not only old age, but the weight of carrying too much wood, too much water, too many children alone. Her back pain was not simply biology. It was history lodged in her spine. She believed her body told the story of war every day she woke up. And I believe her. The truth they don't tell is that women's bodies became battlegrounds themselves. Violence inscribed itself onto them, sometimes in pregnancies they did not choose, sometimes in sickness born of exposure, sometimes in infertility caused by famine. Their bodies archived both survival and violation. And the world looked away, refusing to read the archive written in flesh. But daughters and granddaughters read it. They noticed the limp, the cough that never went away, the reluctance to be touched. They inherited not only stories but gestures, movements, fears transmitted through the body as much as through words. The body became a book passed down, read unconsciously by generations who understood more than they realized. The ashes of their endurance remind us that history is not only written in books but carried in bodies. Women bore this archive involuntarily, inscribed without consent, preserved without rest. And though the world celebrated victories, the true cost of war remained etched in skin, joints and nerves, scars that never healed, archives that never closed. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their bodies never left the battlefield. They carried it within them, every day, every step, every breath. Their silence may have hidden it, but their bodies told the story anyway. And if we listen closely, we can still hear the echoes of those archives today. Hunger as a battlefield. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that hunger was a battlefield just as cruel as any front line. While men fought with rifles and strategies, women fought with empty pots and scraps of food, with children crying through the night, with stomachs that ached until silence replaced their voices. Hunger was not only absence, it was a weapon, deliberate and devastating, wielded by armies and endured by families. Women carried that hunger in their bodies, and long after the war ended, its scars remained. When supply lines collapsed, when villages were burned, when fields were left barren, it was women who had to transform nothing into something. They stretched bread into thin slices, boiled weeds into soup, rationed milk drop by drop. They lied to children, telling them they had already eaten while secretly going without. The battlefield of hunger was fought at tables without food, in kitchens without firewood, in nights where mothers rocked starving infants and whispered lullabies to distract them from pain. I remember hearing of a woman who baked bread from sawdust mixed with flour. She said, "It was not food, but it gave the children the illusion of eating." Her scar was the guilt of feeding poison in place of nourishment, knowing it might kill slowly but believing starvation would kill faster. Hunger forced choices no one should ever make. The truth no one tells is that hunger altered women's bodies permanently. Malnutrition stunted their growth, weakened their bones, decayed their teeth. Pregnant women lost children because their bodies could not sustain them. Those who gave birth often could not produce milk, their breasts dry while infants wailed. Their scars were skeletal frames, brittle bones, aching joints that never fully recovered. Yet hunger was more than physical. It was psychological, reshaping the way women related to food forever. Even decades later, survivors hoarded bread, hid sugar in jars, saved scraps long past expiration. Their pantries were archives of fear, every jar a reminder of famine. Their scars lived in rituals, always cooking too much, always fearing there was not enough, always eating quickly as if food might vanish. My grandmother never left a plate unfinished. Even when full, she forced herself to eat every bite. Food is not to be wasted, she said. But her voice carried an echo. Food may disappear again. That was her scar, a hunger that lived on long after her stomach was full. The truth they don't tell is that hunger silenced entire communities. Weak bodies could not protest, could not resist, could not march. Starvation was strategy, to break spirits, to crush rebellion, to reduce people to shadows of themselves. And women bore the brunt of it, sacrificing their own portions, watching their children waste away, enduring the humiliation of begging or bartering dignity for a loaf of bread. I once read about women who risked their lives smuggling potatoes under their skirts. Soldiers checked bags, searched baskets, but they hid food against their bodies, enduring shame to preserve life. Their scars were not only hunger, but humiliation, the memory of standing before armed men, stripped of dignity, yet refusing to return home empty-handed. The battlefield of hunger extended into memory. Daughters of survivors often inherited habits of scarcity. They grew up with mothers who feared empty cupboards, who panicked if meals were late, who scolded waste with unusual severity. Children who never knew war learned fear of hunger as though it were genetic, passed not through blood, but through behavior. These were invisible scars, carried unknowingly by generations who never starved, yet lived as if famine hovered near. The ashes of hunger remind us that survival demanded more than endurance. It demanded sacrifice, cunning, humiliation. Women bore this battlefield in their bones and in their minds, carrying its scars into every meal, every kitchen, every bite for the rest of their lives. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that hunger was not just an absence of food. It was a constant negotiation with death. And in those negotiations, women paid the price with their bodies, their dignity, and their descendants' inherited fears. Motherhood in ashes. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that motherhood itself became a battlefield. In times of peace, motherhood is already a demanding act of sacrifice and endurance. But in war, it became something else. A desperate attempt to preserve life in the middle of death, to cradle innocence while the world burned. Women carried children in their arms while carrying grief in their hearts. They birthed hope in cellars, fed infants with empty breasts, whispered comfort through trembling lips. Motherhood in war was survival written in lullabies of ashes. Some mothers gave birth among ruins, their cries mixing with the echo of collapsing walls. They cut umbilical cords with shards of glass, washed newborns with rainwater caught in buckets, wrapped them in torn uniforms instead of blankets. Every birth was both miracle and terror, a life brought into a world intent on extinguishing it. Their scars were the memory of delivering children with bombs overhead, the certainty that joy itself could be punished. I remember hearing of a woman who gave birth in a forest, alone, hiding from soldiers. She buried the placenta under leaves, swaddled her child in rags, and kept walking the same night. When asked later how she survived, she answered simply, "I did not survive. I only moved forward." Her scar was that motherhood had been stripped of tenderness, reduced to endurance. The truth no one tells is that mothers starved themselves to feed their children. They pretended not to be hungry, passing the last scraps to small mouths. They stood in ration lines for hours, only to return empty-handed. They endured humiliation, begging soldiers for crumbs, knowing refusal could mean death. Their scars were not only hunger but shame, the memory of pleading for their children's survival. And yet mothers also became inventors. They crushed acorns into flour, turned weeds into stews, created toys from rubble to distract children from fear. They transformed scarcity into creativity, disguising hunger as games. Weaving horror into bedtime stories softened with metaphor. Their scar was knowing that even play had been born from desperation. I once met a woman whose lullabies always carried a minor tone, a sadness she could not shake. Her daughter asked once why her songs were never cheerful. She replied, "Because I sang you to sleep in cellars, not in cradles." Her scar was that motherhood's music had been forever altered by war. The truth they don't tell is that many mothers raised children in silence. Silence about what had happened. Silence about the fathers who never returned. Silence about the things they had seen. They believed they were protecting their children from trauma, but silence became inheritance. Sons and daughters grew up in households where laughter was scarce, where questions met with shadows, where love was filtered through fear. Their scar was not knowing the full truth, but feeling it anyway. Motherhood in ashes also meant mourning. Women carried infants to graves, buried children without coffins, marked graves with stones that later disappeared. They wept in silence, then returned to kitchens, to fields, to rebuilding. Their scar was grief that never healed, hidden beneath chores and obligations, and still, mothers resisted. They resisted despair by braiding their daughters' hair, by teaching their sons to read scraps of newspapers, by insisting on small rituals of normalcy. They planted flowers among rubble, sewed clothes from scraps, told fairy tales even when hope seemed impossible. Their scar was knowing that love itself had become an act of rebellion. The ashes of their endurance remind us that motherhood in war was both unbearable and unstoppable. Women bore children into ruins, fed them with emptiness, raised them in silence, buried them in shadows, and still, they carried on. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that every child who survived carried not only their own life, but also the invisible scars of mothers who gave everything to keep them alive. And those scars, passed down in lullabies and silences, still echo today. The weight of memory. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that survival did not end when the bombs stopped falling or when soldiers left their villages. Survival continued in the silence of memory, a silence heavier than ruins, heavier than graves. Women became carriers of memory, unwilling archivists of horror, custodians of stories they could not tell. And that memory was not neutral. It was weight, constant and suffocating, pressing against them for the rest of their lives. Some memories returned as images too sharp to fade. The flash of fire swallowing a home, the face of a child fading into hunger, the sound of boots approaching. These memories came uninvited, replayed like films behind closed eyelids. They surfaced at night, in dreams that felt more vivid than waking. They appeared suddenly, triggered by smells of smoke, by the crack of wood, by the sight of uniforms. Women carried these memories silently, unable to purge them, unable to forget. Their scar was the prison of remembering. I remember a story told about a woman who could not bear the sound of church bells after the war. For others, bells meant peace had returned. But for her, bells had rung during raids, signaling danger, urging people to run. Each Sunday, when bells tolled, she shook uncontrollably, tears running down her face. Her scar was that memory had turned sound itself into an enemy. The truth no one tells is that memory divided women. Some remembered everything too clearly, unable to let go. Others repressed, refusing to recall, building walls around their pain. Both paths carried scars. One lived with wounds constantly open, the other with wounds festering in silence. Neither found rest. Women often chose silence not because they forgot, but because remembering out loud risked shattering them, or shattering those they loved. They withheld details from children, concealed truths from neighbors, buried confessions in their hearts. But silence was not erasure. It was storage. Their memories remained intact, carried in secret until the end of their lives. Their scar was bearing knowledge too heavy to share. I once met the granddaughter of a survivor. She said her grandmother never spoke of the war, but sometimes she woke up screaming in the night. Her body told me stories her mouth never did, she said. That was the scar of memory. It escaped anyway, through cries, through gestures, through shadows in the eyes. The truth they don't tell is that memory became ritual. Women avoided certain streets, certain songs, certain dates. They cooked specific meals on anniversaries of loss, lit candles for names never spoken, cleaned graves of those never officially buried. Their lives were calendars of wounds, each year circling back to the same scars. Memory was not only in the mind, it was in routine, in repetition, in ritual. And memory did not belong only to them. They passed fragments to their children, often unconsciously. A warning repeated too often, a fear transmitted too strongly, a silence too heavy to ignore. Daughters grew up feeling histories they had never lived. Sons inherited shadows they could not name. The scar of memory became generational, stitched into families like an heirloom no one wanted but everyone received. The ashes of memory remind us that survival is not just about living through war, but about carrying war afterward. Women bore this weight in silence, their minds overcrowded with images too violent for words, their days haunted by anniversaries, their nights shattered by dreams. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that memory itself was a battlefield. They fought to remember so history would not erase them, but they fought also to forget so they could breathe again. Either way, memory was war's final weapon, and women carried its weight within, scars invisible but eternal. When songs fell silent. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that war does not only silence voices through fear, it silences songs. Songs that once filled kitchens, markets, and weddings. Songs that mothers sang to babies. Songs that carried memory, tradition, and joy. In war, music became dangerous. A sound too loud could betray hiding places. A melody could attract soldiers. A lullaby could be interrupted by boots at the door. And so, the songs fell silent, leaving behind an emptiness deeper than hunger. Before war, music was survival of a different kind. Women sang while harvesting, their voices weaving across fields like threads of belonging. They sang while cooking, while washing clothes by rivers, while rocking cradles. Music stitched community together, filling daily tasks with rhythm and meaning. But when war arrived, silence replaced song. The absence was sharp, a wound cut into the air. The scar of that silence stretched across generations. I remember hearing of a mother who used to sing her daughter to sleep every night. When the raids began, she stopped. Her daughter asked why, and she answered, "Because my song is louder than my love. Silence keeps you safe." Her scar was the betrayal of her own voice, turned into danger. The truth no one tells is that even when songs returned, they were never the same. After war, women tried to sing again, but melodies cracked under the weight of memory. A harvest song evoked the year the fields were burned. A wedding song recalled the husband who never came home. Even lullabies carried echoes of nights in cellars, where mothers hummed not for comfort, but to mask explosions. Songs returned fractured, heavy, reshaped by grief. Some women rewrote songs entirely. They turned lullabies into whispered prayers, hymns into cries for the missing, chants into resistance disguised as tradition. Their scars lived in altered lyrics, in notes slowed by sorrow, in refrains that mourned instead of celebrated. Music became both a vessel of memory and a reminder of loss. I once met a woman who never sang again. She had lost her children in the war, and she said, "My voice died with them." Her scar was silence where once there had been music. Her home remained quiet for decades, as if sound itself had betrayed her. But others sang louder, defiant. They gathered secretly in cellars or ruined churches, their voices trembling but determined. They sang to remind themselves they were still human, still alive, still together. Their scar was that singing carried risk, yet silence carried despair. Between the two, they chose defiance in song. The echoes of that silence shaped children too. Sons and daughters of survivors grew up in houses where music was absent, where radios were kept low, where celebrations were muted. They inherited the absence, sensing loss without knowing its full story. Their scar was a childhood without lullabies, without the background music of normal life. The ashes of these silenced songs remind us that war does not only destroy buildings and bodies, it destroys soundscapes. Women bore this loss in their throats, in their silences, in their altered melodies. And though history records battles and treaties, it rarely records the songs that vanished. The music turned into ghosts. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that silence was not only spoken, it was sung. Songs fell quiet, voices cracked, music turned into memory. And those echoes still linger, haunting generations who may never know why their homes grew so quiet. The strength that was never a choice. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their so-called strength was never a gift, never a crown, never a chosen path. It was an imposition. The world stripped away every alternative until strength was the only garment left to wear, the only skin they could not shed. They were not strong because they wanted to be. They were strong because there was no other option. And the scars of that forced strength never faded. People admire them afterward, calling them resilient, unbreakable, heroic. Statues are carved for men who fought, while words like pillar or backbone are reserved for the women who remained. But none of those women asked to be pillars. They did not volunteer to carry the unbearable. They did not dream of becoming symbols of endurance. Their dream had been simpler: safety, family, laughter, ordinary days. War shattered that, and in the ruins, the world demanded they be strong. Their scar was never being allowed to be fragile. I remember my grandmother saying once, "They called me strong because I did not die." But they never asked what died inside me so I could live. She was celebrated for her survival, but survival had cost her tenderness, cost her trust, cost her softness. That was her scar, endurance mistaken for triumph. The truth no one tells is that strength meant silence. Women swallowed fear to soothe children, bit their tongues to negotiate with soldiers, buried grief to keep families standing. They were strong because they could not afford to collapse. But inside, they longed for someone else to carry them, for a chance to fall apart without consequence. That chance never came. The scar was exhaustion so deep it seeped into their bones. Some women carried bodies of husbands, brothers, neighbors, dragging them out of ruins because no men remained. Others rebuilt houses stone by stone, hands blistered and bleeding. They plowed fields with bare tools, walked miles to fetch water, stitched clothes out of rags. They were not strong. They were forced laborers of survival. Their scar was a body aged before its time, backs bent, joints worn down, faces lined decades too early. I once heard of a woman who, after the war, never sat at a table until everyone else had eaten. Even when food was abundant again, she stood, served, waited, ate last. People praised her generosity, her strength of character. But her scar was that she had learned in war that her own hunger was the least important. She never unlearned that lesson. The truth they don't tell is that being called strong often meant being unseen. Communities leaned on women, but no one leaned toward them. Their pain was ignored because their endurance was so visible. Their suffering was dismissed because their survival looked like victory. The scar was loneliness, the weight of being everyone's anchor while drifting silently within. Even generations later, daughters inherited this imposed strength. They were taught not to cry, not to complain, not to appear weak. They grew up in households where fragility was shamed, where endurance was sacred. The inheritance of strength became its own chain, binding women long after the war was over. The ashes of this endurance remind us that strength was not a crown, but a burden. Women bore it on their backs, in their silences, in their children's inheritance. They carried strength like a wound disguised as armor. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that the strength we admire was the weight they never chose. And while history calls them unbreakable, their scars whisper the deeper truth: they survived, but they were tired of being strong in a world that never let them rest. The forgotten graves. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that they became the keepers of graves no one else remembered. When battles ended and soldiers marched on, when politicians signed treaties and historians wrote their books, women remained among the ruins, digging shallow earth with bare hands, marking burial sites with stones, branches, or scraps of cloth. They buried fathers, husbands, children, neighbors, strangers. And then they kept the memory alone, because the world moved on while the dead still weighed in their arms. Some graves were never marked at all. Women buried bodies in fields at night, fearing discovery, knowing soldiers would desecrate them if left exposed. Others piled stones quietly, not daring to speak the names aloud. Their mourning was hushed, their rituals interrupted. Funerals became whispers, prayers shortened by fear, candles hidden in the dark. Their scars were not only grief, but silence. The silence of mourning without recognition. I remember hearing of a woman who buried her son in the backyard beneath a tree. She planted flowers there so no one would know. To others, it was a garden. To her, it was sacred ground. Every spring, when the flowers bloomed, she whispered his name. Her scar was carrying a cemetery inside her own home. The truth no one tells is that women often buried alone. Men were gone, dead, missing, imprisoned. Communities scattered. So it was mothers, sisters, daughters, who carried bodies too heavy for their small frames. They dragged them through rubble, covered them with earth, pressed soil down with trembling hands. Their scar was not only loss, but the physical weight of death carried on shoulders already bent from survival. Some graves were forgotten because they were never allowed to exist. Soldiers forbade burial, leaving women to sneak bodies into shallow pits at night. Others banned mourning, forcing women to pretend nothing had happened while grief burned silently inside them. These graves lived only in memory, mapped within their minds, invisible to the world. Their scar was remembering names with no place to speak them. And even when peace returned, many graves were never found. Mass graves swallowed the unknown. Records were destroyed. Families searched for decades, wandering from office to office, from field to field, carrying photographs of faces no one recognized anymore. Women became archivists of absence, reciting names so they would not vanish completely. Their scar was that memory became cemetery. I once met a daughter who said her mother always kept an empty chair at the table. No one sat there. It was for her father, missing since the war. She said he is buried somewhere, but I don't know where, so we give him a place at home. That chair was a grave disguised as furniture, a scar that lived in the daily rhythm of meals. The truth they don't tell is that graves marked by women were often erased later. When Reconstruction began, new buildings rose on burial grounds. Fields were plowed again. Roads paved over the places where mothers had knelt. Women carried the knowledge of what lay beneath, but no one asked them, no one listened. Their scars were the erasure of sacred ground. And yet, women remembered. They returned to certain trees, certain stones, certain hills, leaving flowers, food, or silent prayers. They carried graves and rituals of care, even when others forgot. They taught children to avoid playing in certain spots, not because the ground was dangerous, but because it was holy. They preserved the invisible cemeteries of war in habits, whispers, traditions. Their scar was memory turned into ritual. The ashes of their mourning remind us that history counts battles and victories, but it does not count graves dug by women's hands. Women bore this scar in their silence, in their gardens, in their empty chairs. They buried not only the dead, but also the right to grieve openly, the dignity of ritual, the permanence of memory. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that for every grave written in history, dozens more remained unmarked, tended only by women who carried the weight of remembrance. And those graves, forgotten by nations, still live in the hearts of the women who never stopped mourning. Daughters of silence. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that silence itself became inheritance. Daughters of survivors grew up breathing in what was never said, absorbing grief that was never explained, carrying fears that were never theirs. They inherited scars carved not into their own flesh, but into the pauses between their mother's words, the shadows in their grandmother's eyes, the rituals that made no sense but were obeyed anyway. They became daughters of silence, guardians of stories half told, carriers of wounds that predated their births. Some daughters learned early that there were questions they could never ask. Why their mothers froze at the sound of boots. Why their grandmothers flinched at church bells. Why laughter was rare at home. They sensed that history lingered in every silence, but the silence was too thick to pierce. Their scar was ignorance shaped like knowledge, knowing something had happened, but never knowing exactly what. I remember a woman telling me that her mother always locked the windows at night, even in summer, even when heat suffocated the room. When she asked why, her mother said only, "It keeps us safe." It wasn't until years later she learned that soldiers had once broken into homes through windows. The silence had protected her as a child, but as an adult it became a scar, a habit of fear inherited without explanation. The truth no one tells is that silence can be louder than words. Children hear it in the breaks of conversation, in the sudden hush when certain topics arise, in the shift of eyes that look away. They grow up fluent in this unspoken language, able to read the room, to sense tension, to know when not to ask. They inherit trauma not through stories, but through atmosphere, living inside a house where silence is both protection and prison. Some daughters became keepers of secrets they did not fully understand. They knew their mothers had suffered, but details were missing. They carried fragments, a scar glimpsed under a sleeve, a photograph hidden in a drawer, a name whispered once then never repeated. Their scar was memory without context, grief without explanation. And yet, daughters also became healers. They tried to break the silence by asking, by writing, by searching archives. Some grew up determined to uncover what had been buried, to give voice to what had been silenced. Their scar was the weight of responsibility, to carry not only their own lives, but also the lives their mothers could not speak of. I once met a granddaughter of a war survivor who said, "I don't know the details, but I know the silence shaped me. I became careful with words, cautious with joy, always aware of danger that wasn't there." That was her inheritance, a nervous system trained by someone else's war, a body that remembered what her mind did not. The truth they don't tell is that silence became culture. Families where laughter was restrained, where meals were eaten quickly, where certain songs were never sung. Children grew up with rules that seemed arbitrary but were anchored in survival. They were taught not to waste, not to trust easily, not to stand out. These rules shaped them long after the war, long after the danger had passed. Their scar was living in peace as if it were still war, but daughters also resisted. Some rebelled against silence, insisting on speaking, on asking, on demanding truth. They turned their mother's unspoken traumas into stories, books, films, testimonies. They refused to inherit silence without transformation. Their scar became their strength, not chosen, but reshaped into voice. The ashes of their inheritance remind us that war does not end with treaties. It lingers in families, in habits, in silences that stretch across generations. Women bore this scar not only in themselves, but in their daughters, who carried echoes of wars they never lived. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that silence was not buried with them. It survived in their children, reshaping lives, echoing through generations. And in those echoes, the war never truly ended. The language of scars. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that scars became their language. In a world where words were censored, silenced, or swallowed, scars spoke louder than voices. They were etched into skin, woven into gestures, carved into silence. They told stories no one dared to say aloud, stories too heavy for paper, too dangerous for confession. Scars became vocabulary, a dialect of survival. A secret language shared by women who recognized each other not by what was spoken, but by what was carried. Some scars were visible, burns from fire, cuts from shattered glass, bullet grazes that brushed but did not claim life. They stretched across arms, faces, backs, maps of endurance drawn without consent. Women who carried them did not need to explain. One glance was enough. A raised brow at a mark on the wrist, a quiet nod at a limp. This was conversation, fluent and silent. Their scar was their testimony, wordless but undeniable. I remember hearing of two women who met years after the war. One rolled up her sleeve by accident, revealing a jagged line down her forearm. The other touched her own arm, almost identical. They did not speak, but in that moment they knew. Their scar was dialogue, recognition without sound, communion without explanation, but most scars were invisible. They lived in the way women jumped at sudden noises, the way they hoarded food, the way they hesitated before trusting laughter. These scars were etched not on skin, but on nerves, on muscles, on reflexes. And women read them fluently. A pause before entering a room, a flinch at a song, a silence at a date, all of it was language. Their scar was not absence, but presence, hidden yet always speaking. The truth no one tells is that scars created community. Women gathered not to share stories, but to share presence. They washed each other's wounds, dressed each other's burns, held each other's shaking hands. They did not always ask how scars had been made. They did not need to. Care itself became grammar. Touch was vocabulary. Silence was punctuation. Their scar was the intimacy of shared survival. I once read about women in a displaced persons camp who created a ritual of tending scars together. They sat in circles, cleaning, wrapping, soothing. No one spoke. The sound of cloth against skin, water poured into bowls, sighs of pain and relief. This was their language. Their scars were not only marks but sentences, telling stories as their hands moved. Yet scars also divided. Some were considered shameful, especially those born of violation. Women who bore them were judged, blamed, silenced further. Their scars became stigma, forcing them into deeper isolation. The language of scars was not always understood. Sometimes it was twisted into cruelty. Their scar was rejection layered on top of pain. The truth they don't tell is that scars were inherited too. Daughters learned the language without ever being taught. They saw the way their mothers moved, the habits they could not break, the rituals they repeated. They grew up fluent in scars that were not theirs, speaking trauma passed down without translation. Their scar was secondhand fluency, knowing too much without understanding enough. I once met a granddaughter of a survivor who said she always carried bread in her bag. She had never known hunger, but her mother had, and her mother's mother before that. "It's like a scar I can't see," she said. That was the inheritance of scars, language spoken across generations without words. The ashes of scars remind us that history is not only written in books, but inscribed on bodies, etched into habits transmitted through silences. Women bore this archive not by choice, but by survival. Their scars were their language, their testimony, their inheritance. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that scars spoke when voices could not. They were conversations carried in flesh, in gestures, in silence. And though the world rarely listened, women recognized one another in this hidden tongue, a language of survival, of pain, of resilience, spoken without words but never without meaning. Rebuilding with bare hands. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that once the guns fell silent and the flags were raised in victory, the ruins did not rise on their own. Buildings did not lift themselves. Streets did not clear of rubble. Fields did not suddenly bloom again. Men who survived often returned broken or absent altogether, but it was women who stayed, who looked at the devastation and bent their backs to put the world together again. They rebuilt with nothing but their hands. Hands blistered, hands torn, hands trembling but relentless. Some carried stones heavier than their bodies could endure, stacking them into walls that leaned like weary shoulders. Others mixed mortar with water hauled in buckets, patching together roofs with whatever scraps of tin remained. They had no gloves, no scaffolding, no blueprints. Their knowledge was not engineering but necessity. Their scar was inscribed in their hands, fingers bleeding, knuckles swollen, skin cracked but still moving, because stillness meant collapse. I remember hearing of women in a small village who gathered after the war, forming a chain to pass bricks from one to another, rebuilding a school where their children could return. They sang no songs, but their silence was rhythm, their effort choreography of survival. When the building stood again, it was not stone alone, but flesh and will that held it upright. Their scar was exhaustion turned into monument. The truth no one tells is that women rebuilt more than structures. They rebuilt trust shattered by betrayal, rituals interrupted by bombs, communities fractured by suspicion. They organized markets where barter replaced money, cleaned wells poisoned by war, replanted gardens in soil still littered with shrapnel. Their work was not only physical, but spiritual, stitching back the torn fabric of life. Their scar was that they were asked to repair a world that had broken them. I once read of a mother who rebuilt her home from rubble, only to collapse when it was finished. She had held herself together for months, brick by brick, day after day. Only when the roof was complete did she allow her body to crumble. Her scar was grief postponed, delayed until the house could stand. Women also became guardians of memory in these reconstructions. They placed stones carefully over unmarked graves, rebuilt shrines where names could be whispered again, lit candles where walls had fallen. Their rebuilding was both practical and sacred. Every wall carried mourning. Every planted tree was both food and prayer. Their scar was mixing survival with remembrance, carrying the dead into the structures of the living, and yet their labor was rarely recognized. Governments praised armies, historians recorded strategies, monuments rose to men. Women's work remained invisible, dismissed as duty, ignored as ordinary. Their scar was invisibility, the weight of rebuilding without acknowledgement, of creating life where the world refused to see creators. Generations later, daughters still told stories of how their mothers' hands were always rough, always tired, always moving. They remembered women who never sat still, who measured rest in stolen moments. The inheritance of scars was visible in habits, hoarding tools, fixing endlessly, fearing collapse even in safety. Their scar was an inability to stop building, because destruction still echoed in their bones. The ashes of their labor remind us that survival is not enough. Rebuilding is the truest resistance. Women bore this scar in their hands, their backs, their rituals. They rebuilt homes, families, hope, not because they wanted to, but because the world demanded it. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that behind every standing village, every harvested field, every school reopened, there were women with blistered hands and exhausted hearts. Their strength was not celebrated in monuments, but it stood in the very walls around us. And those walls, silent and enduring, are their invisible memorials, the weight of strength they never chose. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that the world crowned them with a word they never wanted: strong. It sounds noble, almost divine. It carries admiration, applause, reverence. But in the mouths of those who spoke it, it was also dismissal. Strong meant they could endure anything. Strong meant they didn't need help. Strong meant their pain could be ignored because they would survive anyway. But strength for them was not a gift. It was an imposition. They wore it like armor they never asked for, armor that grew heavier with every passing year. To be called strong is to be denied softness. Women who survived wars were expected to smile while burying their grief, to soothe others while carrying their own scars, to rebuild worlds while their own lives lay in ruins. They were never allowed to collapse, to weep endlessly, to admit that the burden was too much. Their scar was exhaustion masked as resilience, silence mistaken for peace. I remember my grandmother once saying, "They called me strong because I kept walking." But every step was a grave I carried. Her strength was praised, but it had cost her tenderness, laughter, rest. Her scar was the fatigue of living a life defined by survival, not by choice. The truth no one tells is that strength often meant isolation. Communities leaned on women, but rarely leaned toward them. They were everyone's anchor, but no one's safe harbor. Their homes became shelters, their shoulders resting places for others' tears, their hands forever busy feeding, fixing, holding. But when they themselves needed holding, there was no one left. Their scar was loneliness wrapped in admiration. Some women became myths in their villages, known as the ones who never broke, never faltered, never surrendered. But myths are not human. Their legend erased their fragility, their moments of despair, their longing to be cared for instead of always caring. Their scar was invisibility hidden inside visibility, seen as symbols but not as women. I once read of a mother who carried her family through famine, rebuilt her home from rubble, raised her children alone. People called her Iron Woman. She smiled when they said it, but later confessed to her daughter, "I wish someone had allowed me to be weak just once." That was her scar, being denied humanity because she had been forced into resilience. The weight of strength also passed down. Daughters of these women grew up in households where weakness was forbidden, where tears were shamed, where endurance was sacred. They inherited survival as identity, believing they too must never falter. Their some daughters grew up believing that to break was betrayal. They watched their mothers bite down on grief, swallow hunger, endure humiliation without complaint. They learned to copy it. Their scar was secondhand resilience, a mask inherited before they even knew what their own faces looked like. The truth they don't tell is that strength demanded silence. If a woman admitted she could not go on, who would carry the children? Who would fetch the water? Who would repair the roof? Collapse was not an option. It would ripple outward, destroying what fragile order still remained. And so silence became part of strength, and strength became a prison. Their scar was never having permission to say, "I cannot," and yet inside many longed to be fragile. They longed to sit down and let their bodies ache without guilt. They longed to cry openly without fearing their children would lose hope. They longed to be comforted instead of always comforting. But fragility was a luxury of peace, and they lived in the ruins of war. Their scar was yearning for softness in a world that only demanded hardness. I remember a story of a woman who once, after the war, locked herself in a room for an entire day. Neighbors knocked, children called, but she did not answer. Later, she explained that she had simply needed to not be strong for a few hours. But she never repeated it. That single day of retreat was her rebellion, her scar of strength briefly set aside. The truth they don't tell is that being called strong was sometimes cruelty disguised as praise. It excused governments from offering aid, excused communities from acknowledging trauma, excused families from carrying part of the burden. After all, if women were so strong, why would they need help? Their scar was being abandoned beneath the halo of resilience. Even in peace, this strength continued to weigh on them. They became the ones others always turned to, even when their own hearts were crumbling. They became symbols of survival for communities, but their own survival was barely acknowledged. Their scar was living as monuments instead of humans, admired from afar, untouched in their suffering. The ashes of their endurance remind us that strength was never a medal pinned with pride. It was a chain clasped without consent, one they carried through hunger, silence, rebuilding, and memory. Women bore this weight not because they wanted to, but because the world gave them no choice. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that behind every woman called strong is a woman who was denied the right to be weak. And that denial itself was a scar, invisible, silent, endless. The forgotten graves. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that they became the keepers of graves that history forgot. While armies advanced and retreated, while generals drew maps and borders, women remained behind with the bodies. They dug holes with kitchen spoons with bare hands, with sticks sharpened into tools. They buried children, husbands, neighbors, strangers. Sometimes they whispered prayers. Sometimes they wept. Sometimes they remained silent because even mourning could attract danger. Their scar was not only loss but the secrecy of grief. Some graves were shallow, covered quickly before soldiers returned. Others were disguised as gardens, marked with flowers instead of stones. A few were nothing more than earth pressed flat, as if nothing had ever happened. Women became archivists of memory, holding in their hearts the locations of the dead. Decades later, they could still point, here, beneath this tree, there, behind that wall. This road was built on bones. Their scar was the weight of memory carried alone. I remember hearing about a woman who buried her daughter in the night, wrapping the small body in a torn shawl. She placed a single stone to mark the spot. But when she returned days later, the stone was gone, carried away by children playing, by wind, by time. She searched desperately, but the place was lost. Her scar was not only her daughter's death, but the theft of her grave, the unbearable truth of not knowing where she lay. The truth no one tells is that women often buried more than bodies. They buried names because speaking them was dangerous. They buried photographs, burned letters, hid objects that could betray identities. Their mourning was incomplete, stripped of ritual. Funerals became whispers, ceremonies shortened into fragments, grief swallowed in silence. Their scar was unfinished mourning, open wounds disguised as endurance. Some graves were erased intentionally. When villages were rebuilt, new houses rose over burial sites. Roads paved over sacred ground. Fields were plowed where women had wept. And yet women remembered. They avoided certain corners, lit candles in hidden places, taught children not to play near certain trees. Memory became their only headstone, their silence the only inscription. I once read of women who created invisible cemeteries, not by carving names into stone, but by repeating them in prayers year after year. They said the names at night, under their breath, long after others had forgotten. Their scar was carrying entire cemeteries in their mouths, turning memory into gravestones of sound. The truth they don't tell is that forgotten graves are not only those without markers, but those carried in women's bodies. Every miscarriage born of hunger, every infant lost to cold, every relative who vanished and was never returned, these too were graves, invisible yet heavy. Women bore them in their silence, in their eyes, in the way they flinched at children's laughter because it reminded them of absence. And still, women resisted erasure. They planted flowers where bones lay, rebuilt shrines with scraps, carved names secretly into wood. They refused to let the dead vanish entirely. Their scar was mourning transformed into defiance. The ashes of their grief remind us that war leaves behind not only ruins of stone, but ruins of memory. Women bore this scar in gardens that were cemeteries, in prayers that were funerals, in silences that were tombstones. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that history counts battles, but it does not count graves dug by women's hands. And yet those graves, forgotten by the world, remain alive in memory, carried by women who refused to forget, even when silence demanded it, inheriting the ashes. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their silence, their fears, their scars did not end with them. They were passed down, carried into kitchens and lullabies, stitched into habits and rituals, inherited by daughters and granddaughters who never saw the front lines yet lived as though the war still echoed through their walls. What could not be buried in graves was buried in gestures, in warnings, in the careful way women moved through the world. The ashes of war were inherited like heirlooms. Some daughters learned to live with absence before they understood its meaning. They noticed empty chairs at tables, locked drawers with hidden photographs, birthdays uncelebrated because the person had never returned. They grew up in homes where shadows spoke louder than words, where silence taught more than lessons. Their scar was not the memory of bombs, but the inheritance of grief disguised as normal life. I remember a granddaughter telling me that her grandmother always bought too much flour, even when cupboards were full. She said we might need it, the girl explained. Years later, she realized it was not practicality but trauma, an echo of famine carried forward. Her scar was learning fear of hunger she never endured. The truth no one tells is that trauma does not die with one generation. It seeps into bloodlines, into nervous systems, into the way children flinch without knowing why. Sons and daughters of survivors inherited hypervigilance, mistrust, caution. They became adults who locked doors twice, who saved food compulsively, who carried guilt for lives they never lived. Their scar was secondhand memory, invisible yet indelible. Some grandchildren carried stories without context. They overheard fragments whispered at night, noticed scars glimpsed accidentally, pieced together puzzles with missing pieces. Their inheritance was mystery, knowledge that something terrible had shaped their family, but silence that refused to explain. That silence became a scar of its own, a haunting absence more powerful than truth. I once met a woman who said her mother never allowed laughter at the dinner table. Not because she was cruel, but because laughter had once betrayed them during hiding. The daughter grew up associating joy with danger, happiness with risk. That was her scar, inherited ashes of fear, carried into a life where peace was never fully trusted. The truth they don't tell is that women tried to protect their children by withholding stories, by burying memory. But protection became inheritance. Silence became teaching. Daughters absorbed pain not through words but through atmosphere. They felt it in the tension of rooms, in the eyes that looked away, in the rituals that seemed senseless but were never questioned. The scar was protection that hurt as much as revelation, and yet some daughters transformed the ashes into fuel. They broke silence, asked questions, wrote books, sang songs again. They carried the trauma forward not as prison but as testimony. Their scar became their weapon. Voice against erasure, memory against forgetting, story against silence. The ashes of inheritance remind us that war does not stay buried in graves. It travels forward, carried in gestures, in fears, in lullabies sung with trembling voices. Women bore this scar not only in themselves, but in those who came after them. Their silence became echo, their scars became lineage, their grief became atmosphere. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that the war never truly ends. It lingers in descendants, in habits unexplained, in fears unearned. The ashes of survival are passed on, carried in silence by generations who inherit scars they cannot name. The price history never paid. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that history never settled its debt with them. Nations celebrated victories, generals were immortalized in statues, soldiers' names engraved in marble. But the women, the ones who held the dead, who buried the forgotten, who rebuilt homes with bleeding hands, who carried silence like a shroud, were left out of the ledgers of glory. Their sacrifices were counted as natural, their pain dismissed as background noise, their survival taken for granted. The world moved on, but the scars remained, unpaid. After wars ended, medals were handed out in ceremonies, pensions distributed, speeches delivered. Yet mothers received no recognition for starving so their children might live. Wives were not honored for carrying families alone. Daughters were not celebrated for burying fathers in unmarked graves. Their scars remained invisible, and what is invisible is easy to ignore. The scar of women in war was not only trauma, it was erasure. I remember my grandmother standing in front of a monument carved with the names of fallen men. She whispered, "Where are our names? We died too, but differently." Her scar was not only what she endured, but being written out of the very history she helped sustain. The truth no one tells is that women paid the war's price with their bodies, their dignity, their futures. They gave birth in cellars, buried infants in gardens, negotiated with soldiers to keep children alive, rebuilt homes from rubble. Yet governments forgot them, historians ignored them, communities silenced them. Their scars were receipts for debts never repaid. Even peace was costly. When men returned, women were expected to step back, to return to silence, to erase their resilience. They had managed farms, villages, households. Now they were told to be quiet again, to make space for the stories of soldiers. Their scar was being asked to disappear just when they had proven indispensable. I once read about a woman who, after the war, applied for recognition as a survivor. She was told, "You were not at the front. You were not a fighter." But she had buried 3 children, hidden dozens of neighbors, and rebuilt her home with her own hands. Her scar was that her battlefield did not count. The truth they don't tell is that even generations later, the debt remained unpaid. Grandmothers died without telling their stories. Mothers carried silence to their graves. Daughters inherited fears without knowing their origins. The cost of survival stretched beyond one lifetime, passed down as ashes, and yet women carried on. They raised children who became doctors, teachers, poets. They rebuilt villages into cities. They sang again, even if songs cracked under memory. They wrote testimonies, even if too late for justice. Their scars remained invisible to history, but they remained visible to those who loved them. The ashes of their endurance remind us that history is incomplete. It writes of treaties and victories, but forgets the kitchens where hunger was fought, the gardens that were cemeteries, the hands that rebuilt walls, the silences that carried truth. Women bore this scar not for themselves alone, but for generations. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that the price of survival was never paid by history. It was paid by women, silently, invisibly, endlessly. And until their stories are told, the debt remains open.